How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be talking about the moves that the Hamilton Tigercats have made in the 2023 offseason. There has perhaps been no busier team this offseason than the Hamilton Tigercats, coming off a so-so season last year where they kind of made the best of it in the second half of the season, but for the most part, it was a major disappointment for a team that had Grey Cup expectations. So moves like this were needed, and let's talk about them. So let's start off with their key re-signings here, starting with linebacker Simone Lawrence that they bring back. Can't even remember how many seasons he's been with the Tigercats now, the longest tenured player on the team, I believe tied with Ted Laurent, defensive tackle. And honestly, I think that Simone, I don't know how much of a top tier player he is anymore necessarily, but I think from a leadership standpoint and just the fact that he's the heart and soul of this organization, that's where his value really lies with this organization. He's still a very good linebacker. I wouldn't say he's perhaps the best linebacker in the CFL today like he was a couple of years ago, but still a very important piece for this defense and an important guy to bring back. They also bring back wide receiver Tim White, just so crucial. I really can't understate how important this was for the Tigercats. If they had lost Tim White, the outlook of this offseason would have been tremendously different. And Tim White was really their offense last season. Go back to that game against Calgary, made that spectacular catch to really set up the touchdown and then caught the touchdown the next play. An incredible player for this team. The best player on this team last season was Tim White, and it was very crucial for the Tigercats to bring him back. A young player, could still see the best of him in the CFL going forward, so really excited to see him back with the Tigercats. They also bring back defensive end Malik Carney, who should have his best years coming up here in the CFL. Has been in the league for a couple of years now. Finally started to break out last season. Had the big game against Winnipeg where I think he had 3 sacks. On the season, I think he had like 7 sacks or so. And I think he's an ascending player, like I said, going to make a great tandem with another guy that they brought in free agency. And I'm really excited to see him back with the Tigercats. And then the final guy I want to highlight here is quarterback Matt Schultz, who will be the backup to Bo Levi-Mitchell. And I think Schultz played relatively well most part last season. You know, he just struggled when he got on the field because of injuries. And I think overall he was the best quarterback that the Tigercats had put out there last season. So I'm happy to see him back in black and gold. And with that said, let's get into the additions and subtractions. So let's turn over to the whiteboard, starting with the additions that the Tigercats have made, and there are a lot of them. There are a few that I just couldn't even fit on the board here that we'll still talk about, but like I said, ran out of room on the whiteboard. So starting with the big addition, you got to start with the trade for Bo Levi-Mitchell before free agency started. A couple of months before free agency started, they were kind of in limbo whether or not they're going to be able to get Bo Levi-Mitchell signed. He was a pending free agent, but ultimately they get the deal done. 3 years. I think it's like $1.5 million total deal amount of the deal, and they land the big quarterback fish that was going to be in free agency this year. Bo Levi-Mitchell, obviously, he's had his issues the last couple of years of his career in comparison to how the first 6 or so years of his career went with Calgary. But I still think there's a solid floor there if he gets put in the right system. Maybe he really reemerges in another environment. We see that all the time in the CFL. So I'm excited to see what Bo has for the second chapter of his career with his second team. And I thought it was a very wise move for the Tigercats to really go aggressively and go out and get their guy. Then they stay busy when the free agent market opens by bringing back defensive end Ja'Gared Davis from the Toronto Argonauts. And I think this is perhaps the most crucial addition other than Bo Levi-Mitchell, because Ja'Gared Davis was such a key player for this team in 2019 and 2021. He was really their closer back end of games. In 2022, when he went to Toronto, Hamilton really struggled with closing games that they had fourth quarter leads, and I think he's really going to help them do that and really provide that edge rush. And, you know, besides that, he actually was better with the Tigercats than he was with Toronto last season. I think he had some moments with the Argos, obviously helped that team win a Grey Cup last year, but in terms of production, kind of a down year for him. So I think he'll bounce back a little bit in the black and gold, and I think that it's a good fit for both the player and the team to have a reunion here. They also they bring in defensive end Kwaku Boateng, perhaps the best Canadian defensive lineman in the league when he's healthy, but missed all of last season due to Achilles injury. I believe he suffered in training camp with Ottawa, so never got to play for Ottawa, but had many good years in Edmonton as a very productive pass rusher. He is going to be in a platoon situation with Mason Bennett at that other defensive end spot, so I think they're going to go Canadian at one of the defensive end spots for the Tigercats this year and do a rotation with Bennett and Boateng. I think it's really going to bring the best out of both guys. And then on the other side, you'll have a situation where you can rotate Malik Carney and Jagger Davis. So I'm really excited for that defensive line in Hamilton. I think one of the weaker points of this team last year. And then they bring in linebacker Jameer Thurman, and I'm really excited about this addition because people that watch my free agency preview videos know that I had Jameer Thurman ranked as my #1 linebacker going into free agency this year. He just provides so much versatility. He can play weak side, he can play middle. He's going to play middle with the Tigercats because Simone Lawrence is going to be playing his normal weak side spot. But very excited to see what Jameer Thurman brings to the table here. The only question I have with him is sometimes he struggled to stay healthy due to injuries. But when he's out there on the field, he's one of the guys that really can affect passing lanes. One of the best coverage linebackers in the game. Just has a lot of versatility, like I said. Can be a tackling machine as well. But just a playmaker back there. And I'm really excited to see what he brings to this defense this year. And then one of the more controversial additions is strong side linebacker / defensive back Chris Edwards that they bring in from the Toronto Argonauts. And this is the guy that actually jumped into the stands a few years ago and was fighting fans at the East Final. But, an excellent player for the Argos the last couple of years. A guy that can really be described as a playmaker, had multiple pick sixes, I believe it was last year or maybe it was the year before, but a dynamic player that, you could add to this defense. They lose the guy that they had in that role, which we'll talk about in a minute, but I think Edwards will be a welcome addition to this defense and can play multiple spots for them if they want to shift him back to the secondary and play someone else at that strong side linebacker spot. I think they could do that. But Edwards, a very welcome addition, even if it was a pretty unexpected one given the history there between the Tigercats and him. And then Casey Sales, defensive tackle from the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, comes over. And I think this is a really good addition as well. You have Dylan Wynn coming off a season-ending injury this past year. You don't know how he's going to be at the start of the season. Sales is an ascending player, should get better in an even bigger opportunity perhaps here in Hamilton, and was already a very productive player the last couple of years in Winnipeg. So I'm excited to see what he adds to the defense. Has a little bit of pass rush upside, which you'd like to see, and I think this defensive line really shaking up really well after the offseason additions for Hamilton. And then you have running back James Butler, comes over from the BC Lions, had a career year last year, really broke out into a CFL feature back, can catch the ball out of the backfield, has a lot of versatility, can run between the tackles, run outside the tackles, has a decent amount of elusiveness as well. I am really excited to see what he brings to this offense, and these other additions we'll talk about in a sec bring to this offense. I think it could be really improved from what we saw last season, and I think Butler could be a big part of that. I think, honestly, they didn't really get too much from the running backs last year, especially catching the ball. I think that was such a weakness of this team last year. You do bring back Sean Thomas Erlington as well as the backup spot, but I think he is definitely better suited to being the #2 guy in the CFL. Great change of pace back, but Butler will be the true #1 running back for this team, and I'm really excited to see him in black and gold. Then we have wide receiver Duke Williams, who comes over from the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Had a very controversial season last year. Some incidents involving saliva, but a guy that I think has so much talent and showed it when he came back to the CFL in 2021. for a few games, and then last year was just kind of a total disaster in Saskatchewan, sorry. And I think that he has the decent opportunity to rebound here with the Tigercats. He's not going to be expected to play that #1 role. Tim White will be the #1 receiver for this offense. You do have Braylon Addison, but he is coming off an injury. So I think Duke Williams will be placed in a pretty big role in this offense, but not asked to be the go-to guy, which I think is key. And we'll have to see if the discipline issues, if he keeps his nose clean here in Hamilton. And then you have left tackle Joel Figueroa that they bring in from BC as well. And I think this could be the biggest addition this offseason other than Bo Levi Mitchell. I know I said that about Jagger Davis, but I actually think this might be the biggest addition because Bo Levi Mitchell, pocket passer, you're going to have to protect him, and having a solid left tackle is going to be so important. This has been an issue that's been a revolving door since 2019, where they had a key free agent walk out the door that year. And I think getting that left tackle spot is going to be super key for Hamilton. Figueroa played in Hamilton at the beginning of his CFL career. Glad to see a reunion here years later. And then the final guy I want to talk about here is defensive back Javian Elliott. And he's not super notable. He hasn't played a ton in the CFL. Mostly been a guy that's been in and out of the lineup with Calgary the past couple of seasons. But because of the losses, we'll talk about in a second about the defensive back room, he's going to be asked to play a pretty big role, I think, on this team this year. So I think he's worth noting. Other guys that they've signed that I couldn't fit on the board here, linebacker Fraser Sopik, a Canadian guy from Western University, so comes home from Calgary to play closer to home here in Southern Ontario. S.A. Marabure, defensive lineman, former high pick in the CFL draft, mostly just a depth defensive lineman there to put behind guys like Ted Laurent in the interior. And then wide receiver Chris Usi-Kusi and Levi Noel, depth Canadian receivers to compete with their existing guys. I think they're just going to start one Canadian receiver this year. I do believe it's either going to be Keandre Smith or Tyler Tanowski, but I think Usi-Kusi or Noel could be a good guys to have in competition there. And Noel is an excellent special teams player as well. It's worth noting. And yeah, that's the list of guys that they brought in free agency this year. Quite a list for the Tigercats. Very, very busy this offseason. Now turning ourselves over to the other side of the board with the guys that they lost this offseason, starting with wide receiver Steven Dunbar that goes to the Edmonton Elks. He was the #2 guy on this team last year, but had some inconsistencies with drops that really bothered a lot of fans of the Tigercats. So I think that he'll be missed. And he was a guy that is relatively young, so he could have some bigger years in the CFL ahead. But I think as of the player he was last year, I don't think it was a massive loss, especially when you're replacing him with Duke Williams. I think has the potential to have even higher production than Dunbar had last year. And then you have a trio of defensive backs here with Seontae Evans, Jamal Roll, and Cariel Brooks. Seontae Evans and Jamal Roll go to the Montreal Alouettes in free agency. Seontae Evans had an excellent season last year for the Tigercats, had so many pass knockdowns, so I think he's a guy that will be missed, but a guy that also is getting up there a little bit in age, been in the CFL for a while. That usually hits defensive backs a little bit harder than other positions. Jamal Roll, an in-prime corner for this team last year, but had his moments where he just was not up to snub. I think he was getting burnt in some cases. So I think that, especially those matchups with Eugene Lewis, I felt like he wasn't really playing that well last season. So I think he's a good player, but I don't know how much of a loss that's really going to be felt because this defensive back room was loaded last season. They went heavy on defensive back. Didn't necessarily work out for them. Now they're going more heavy on defensive line, so we'll see how it works out for them. And then they surprisingly cut defensive back Cariel Brooks, who I thought was the best player out of those three players and a guy that I was really counting on to be a big piece of this team next year. He gets released and goes to Ottawa, and I think that was a really great addition for Ottawa. Big loss for the Tigercats. I think he's one of the best halfbacks in the league, so going to be interesting to see how he plays in Ottawa and how the Tigercats replace him in the lineup. They also trade away, obviously, quarterback Dane Evans. I have it on the side of the board there in purple. Obviously, had a really struggling season last year for the Tigercats, and they were going to go in a different direction at quarterback, bringing in Mitchell. But, really appreciative of the time that Evans had with the Tigercats ultimately. But I wish him the best in BC in a tandem role there with Vernon Adams. They also lose middle linebacker Javon Santos-Knox, their tackle leader from last season, but they replace him with Jameer Thurman, which I would argue is an upgrade. Santos-Knox is an excellent player, really a physical presence for the defense. I think that's what we're going to miss more than anything. Maybe we lose a little bit of that tough run defense in the middle, but I think Santos-Knox is going to do excellent in Ottawa. Just a very talented player, and you really see his presence out there on the field. Now you have defensive end Julian Hauser that also leaves. Obviously, with the additions on the defensive line, not everybody could really stay with this Tigercats unit. But Hauser, kind of a versatile player, can play a little bit of special teams, can drop into coverage from his defensive end spot. Just a very interesting player, but not necessarily a number one pass rusher by any stretch. He goes to Calgary, so I don't think this is ultimately a very big loss because of all the guys they brought in on the defensive line, especially at the end spot. They also lose defensive tackle Micah Johnson to the Saskatchewan Roughriders, a guy that played here for one season with the Tigercats, had some really big games, and then other games that he was kind of invisible. So I'm wishing him the best in Saskatchewan, going back there for a third stint, but I think with the addition of Sales, who's a younger player and arguably a very similar quality of player, I think that was a pretty good move for the Tigercats to switch those guys out. And then you have depth wide receivers Lamar Durant and David Unger. Durant, terrible free agent addition last year, just missed part of the season due to injury, but then when he got on the field, he just was not productive at all. Just a lot of games where he didn't make a catch at all. So ultimately, he was a big flop for the Ticats, but he goes to Ottawa in free agency like a lot of these guys. So we'll see if he bounces back there. David Unger goes down to QEW to Toronto, and a guy that I just haven't really loved the upside on. He's a tiny little receiver that can make some plays for you. He made a big play in the Labor Day game a couple of years ago, scoring the touchdown in that game. But at the end of the day, I think it was time for the Tigercats to move on and really prioritize these other Canadian receivers they have on the roster. Then you have kicker punter Michael Domagala, who had his struggles with the Tigercats the past couple seasons, but I think ultimately he settled in quite nicely to that punting role they had him doing last season after they brought in Seth Small to do the kicking duties. But ultimately, just not a super important guy for the roster, and I think that's why the Tigercats moved on. And then these other guys at the bottom here, and I want to keep these guys separate from the guys that left to go play in the spring leagues down south. But these are three big additions, subtractions for the Tigercats. Strong side linebacker Cam Kelly goes to the XFL with San Antonio, I do believe. Just an excellent player last season, was a CFL All-Star, if I recall correctly, or at least he deserved to be. He was an excellent player for this team the past couple of years. May have been the MVP of the Grey Cup if the Tigercats had beat Winnipeg in that game. But at the end of the day, just a big loss to lose him, especially to another league there. Offensive tackle Colin Kelly, who stepped in really well for this team last year at the tackle position. But at the end of the day, I think that they bring in Figueroa. They still have Chris Van Zyl. They still have Tyrone Riley, who's a young and up-and-coming player on their offensive line. I think they will be able to replace Colin Kelly. He goes to Seattle in the XFL. And then running back Wes Hills goes to the USFL's New Orleans Breakers. I believe the same team as McLeod Bethel Thompson. And he's a guy that really showed a lot of promise towards the back end of last year, but not a guy that has a lot of potential in terms of catching the ball out of the backfield. Really doesn't have much versatility. He's really just a downfield runner. And, it has value, obviously, and you saw that at the end of last season for the Tigercats. But I do think James Butler is a big upgrade from the backfield position for the Tigercats. So those are just their losses. Obviously, a lot of guys here, but I do think they adequately replace them and upgrade them with the additions over here. But with that said, those are just my thoughts on the Tigercats offseason so far. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section. Did this team get a lot better? I personally think that this team looks a lot better on paper, with the exception of that defensive back room, which has a lot to be sorted out, especially with a lot of the key veterans that they lost. But I like the trade-off of going heavy on the defensive line, which was really a big weakness for them last year. So if they can figure out the defensive back room, I think they're going to be a very good team this year. And I'm really excited to see this team on the field in 2023. But with that said, I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.